Right out on Eagle Road in front of the sign there, David. Watch,
I'm actually
watch out for cars.
I'm actually in Charlotte, North Carolina, in my hotel room, hence the background. Well, good morning, everybody. It's great to be back with you. I always so look forward to my time with you. And as I think you know by now, I love to pick topics that I'm interested in that I don't necessarily know a ton about, and do research on them, and then kind of share what I found with you to keep learning with and from you as well. And so the topic for these 3 weeks together is decolonization. And either Jim or Tim, I'm wondering if you can allow me to share my screen there.
You should be able
to have, as usual, a
PowerPoint.
PowerPoint.
Hang on a second, let me double check.
Yeah, Frank is our IT whiz.
You're good. Sorry, I forgot to turn that one on.
There we go. Got it. All right. So let me just share that there, and I'll go into presentation mode here. Let's see if I can click on this. All right. So you know the title there. You've seen the title. This word decolonization and really kind of what we could call a process is something that I've started running into more and more over the last year and a half in many different spheres, especially anything having to do with international development, with missions. It's actually been going on for a while. That term just hasn't necessarily been used. But the healthcare sector now, and community development and finance, I actually assigned a book to my fundraising class. It was called Decolonizing Wealth. So there's a lot going on there. And as you know, one of the things that we always want to try to do as Christians is to see what is going on in the world. How can we interpret it? How can we engage it in such a way to bring it under the lordship of Christ? And that's really the kind of what we want to try to do over these next 3 mornings, is to kind of get a handle on what is this? What is the scope in which this is occurring, as far as what the language is, but not just language, concrete actions that are going on. And then from a Christian viewpoint, right, what can we learn and use from it, and also what might give us some pause, right? What might we have to be cautious about? So for this morning, it's more of an introduction. We'll have 2 more mornings together, really looking at starting to define, right, what decolonization is. In order to do that, we need to first understand what the backdrop is of what people are talking about, what kind of colonialism, because if you're decolonizing, that means that there was a colonizing, or continues to be a colonizing, according to many. You know, what the main concepts and terminology are that underpin it. And then also this morning, just very briefly, I don't want to go into too much, and this will be more for next week. You know, what is its scope? Where is it being used? And as I said, it's pretty much everywhere at this point. I wouldn't be surprised, just as with critical race theory, intersectionality, and social justice, as we saw last year, if decolonizing and that term and that word starts to become more prevalent in the political spheres, in terms of people either using it as a bogey person, or using it to promote certain agendas. And then also just starting this morning, just kind of take a little bit of a theological swing at it. So let me just start out by this, where I'm really curious, in terms of you all, where have you heard the term decolonization or to decolonize apply? Just jump in. I'm curious to see if you've run across it as well, or if this is something quite new for you.
It's new for me, but I read about it when I read op-ed pieces out of the Wall Street. So that's my honest opinion.
Thanks. No, I appreciate that. Yeah. And just to follow up to that, what kind of op-ed pieces do you recall? Is it dealing with finance? Is it dealing with, what kind of things is it dealing with, if it comes to mind?
Yeah, I think they were talking about healthcare, like signing agreements for healthcare workers, things like that. Yeah, that was the context of it.
Yeah, healthcare is a big one. Yeah.
I'm not sure how much this fits into it, but I was just reading about different archaeological finds from Egypt and the Sinai that are still now in museums in St. Petersburg or London or places like that, and Egypt wanting those things to be returned.
Yep, absolutely, definitely does apply. That would be kind of the decolonizing, right, of museums in a sense. Yeah, good.
I have one that's it's kind of old, but it's the interaction between the Neanderthals and Homo sapiens, and how the Homo sapiens colonized and absorbed and eventually wiped out the Neanderthals.
Yeah, interesting. I hadn't heard that one. Thanks for bringing that one up.
Huh.
Yeah.
It's peripheral.
According to my wife, I'm still on Neanderthal side. Still a few of us around, huh?
Yeah.
Yeah, we have the DNA.
I don't know whether it's too peripheral, but the continuing discussion of reparations between with sons, great grandsons and daughters of Black slaves may fall into that in some way.
It absolutely does. Yep, and actually, the race and racial element is front and center in terms of much, if not most, of the decolonizing language. Good. Others.
The idea of whose land is this? I guess idea of discovery. I was reading a little bit about Henry VII and sending John Cabot from Italy, to represent England and claim land for England.
Yep, land is a big one, and I don't know how many of you run into it if you've attended conferences where more and more now, even by Zoom, right? It's become more and more the norm of paying tribute to the indigenous peoples in the United States from whose land, right, you are speaking, and so to honor both the tribes or the memory of the tribes. There's been some pushback against that by some tribes themselves, saying it's just tokenism, but absolutely, land is a big one. Yeah. Others, where else have you heard this?
Well, we've seen it put in practice in South Africa, because the ANC has gone back to reclaiming their farmland by force, killing white settlers who in no way, shape, or form performed the first outrage so many hundreds of years ago. And now those white settlers live in fear for their lives, and the ANC's theme is, we're just taking back what was ours that you stole in the first place.
Yeah. By the way, when you refer to settlers, you're talking about 7 and 8 generations of settlers.
Right, and that terminology of settlers actually is applied in terms of analysis, even to called present day settlers, and not just South Africa, right? Zimbabwe as well. There was a seizing of white-owned farms for that very aspect, right, of decolonizing, reclaiming the land. Yep. Any other places that you've heard this applied?
In a sense, you might say there's the process still goes on, because colonization could be applied to Russia's reacquisition of the Ukraine and China's acquisition of Taiwan.
Yep, very good. Yeah, so in geopolitics, right, international politics, yep, colonization, or even quote unquote imperialism, right, those terms continue to be applied.
Does it also apply to intellectual property as opposed to just real property?
Very much so. Yep. As we'll see, not only intellectual property, but also knowledge as a whole. So it may not just be on the proprietary level, but anything that has to do with knowledge, right? And many times positing indigenous knowledge versus Western knowledge. So that is a huge area as well in which it's applied. Good. Yep.
One other thing, David, I don't know if anybody heard this or picked it up, but during the Queen's funeral, some of the commentators were talking about countries where some of the gemstones, Cullinan the First, or I forget specifically which ones, need to be repatriated back to those countries.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. That's very good. And as a matter of fact, right, during the Queen's funeral, I don't know how many of you saw some, shall we say, counter currents and counter writings, right? Because so many people were celebrating the Queen in her life for many others, right, coming from a quote unquote indigenous or colonized perspective, it actually was motive of writings of saying, well, wait a minute, this is actually what she presided over, especially earlier in her life. So not quite such glowing tributes from some sectors. Mm-hmm.
It was interesting to hear her recordings of her when she first took the throne, and she ended by saying, "This I represent you all as a country and this imperial family."
Right. Right. Yeah, that did not go over very well, as you can imagine. Yeah. Uh-huh.
But I think when you look at the life of the Queen, she presided over the dissolution and the decolonization, but the letting all of the empire going back to local rule.
Right, and that points to, as we'll see, within the decolonization movement, it is by no means a homogeneous movement. As you can imagine, right, there are people who are have both been through and who are pressing for decolonization that might be at odds with some facets of it. So thanks for sharing. Let's jump into it then. And again, I'm just going to present an overview. We'll have then some time for at the end, but for just kind of some back and forth and continue to explore this. But as usual, at any time, feel free to jump in, just unmute yourself, jump in if you have any questions or anything to add. So let's start out by defining it. And by defining it, we really need to go a little bit to understand what the different kind of definitions and understandings of colonization is. So let's start there, because really in order to understand the full scope of decolonization, we have to understand how people are positing what the full scope of colonization was. So just a straight dictionary definition of colonization, right? It's to take control of an area, of people, especially as an extension of state power, to claim someone or somebody as a colony. It obviously, land is a big one, right? When we think of colonies and colonization, that's probably what we think of first, right? A geographic space. Many times, right, we think of the geographic space, we think of the resources, and then we think of people. Sometimes people come a little bit last, right? We just think of a territory, but in addition to this physical control, right, there is a whole set and slew of understandings of colonization that really were part of what people have labeled the colonial project. So let's take a little bit of a look at this, right? This colonial project, if you think about it, and the British Empire, James, I think you were the one who brought that up, is a perfect example of it. It's not just driven by a desire to take over land and to use the resources. It's mixed motives, right? Part of it was also, and I know this may be a little bit tough to hear, but it's driven by also many times a desire to help others. And right, it tends to have been in historical parlance, right, driven by a sense that those people over there are primitive, we're civilized, we need to bring civilization to them, right? So it's not just, it definitely is, right, a military aspect of conquest, but we can't forget this part. It's also a sense of a cultural conquest, and not just a conquest to reap the benefits, but to take the benefits of one's own civilization to others. That's fundamental to understanding what this is. So what that means is, right, it is a project, as understood, of cultural superiority, of a way of being. And I just put a couple of things there, right? The way you dress, right? If you are a proper human being, right, you dress a certain way. The way you view time, right, the way you act in all spheres of life. Think in the religious dimensions. When the missionaries went over, they took their cultural project with them, right? How you worship, the hymns that you sang, right? And so it's, in addition, right, to culture, it also is a firm conviction in the superiority of knowledge, right? The superior of your knowledge as a colonizer. You obviously have greater scientific knowledge, right? Western knowledge, quote unquote. And we'll look at that label a bit more and how that label is, I feel, a little bit problematic to help us to understand everything. But let's use that label for now, right? The Enlightenment project, the scientific advances, right? What that meant was this knowledge is much superior. And in all these areas, right, indigenous knowledge or local knowledge is downplayed. Political knowledge, right, how you organize your state. Think of what the colonies did, right? They recreated, right, representational politics there. Economic knowledge, you know, how do you run an economy? How do you create industries? How do you create businesses? Things that were not seen as existing there in any way, shape, or form. And of course, superiority of religious knowledge. You can't really, if you look at the history of colonization, it's not in all cases, but especially from the West, right? The one that became the most dominant was very much tied in with Christianity's project at the time. Think of the Catholic outreach, right? The Catholic colonization, but not just Catholic, Protestant as well, right? Think of the Dutch, think of the British. It goes hand in hand. So this colonial project, right, was one that was not just, to summarize, a land and resource issue. This was something that had all kinds of knowledge dimensions to it, cultural dimensions to it, and of course that leads us into the psychological dimensions and everything else. So what was the end result of colonization of this colonial project? Right, the colonizers' culture, their approaches, their attitudes are affirmed as superior. That means automatically, right, that the local people, the indigenous people, the people of color, right, are seen and portrayed as inferior in all of these dimensions. They're seen as having little to nothing to contribute in terms of culture, right, in terms of knowledge of any kind. And so the end result is that the cultural, the economic, the social, the religious, the political systems, right, are all set up in such a way, using that power to diminish the cultures, knowledge, and voices of the indigenous people. All right. So the claim then is that this colonial project, or what many times is called neo-colonialism, right, or these colonial logics, continue to operate today. It may be that kind of the land and the imposition of one's own might on others has diminished significantly, although, as you all brought up, right, the Russian project with Ukraine, I mean, if you look at that, right, that is very much a cultural project as well. As somebody mentioned, China and Taiwan, I don't know if that's as much a cultural project as it is asserting authority, but the claim is that this kind of approach continues to oppress and permeate not just inside individual societies, but across borders, right? And so what you have from this point of view, of analysis, right? And again, remember, we're defining what the full scope is of colonization so we can understand what the arguments are for decolonization, is that now you have a situation set up of systemic injustice, right, where you have marked differences in well-being, right, between those who are indigenous and the people of color and those who are white. So you can see that race automatically comes into the picture here. Right? The colonial project is seen as one of white supremacy. And as we know from our conversations last year, right, on critical race theory and intersectionality and social justice, right, there's the race very much, right, is part of the parlance of how one analyzes this. It also means, right, therefore, that what we can benefit from the local knowledge and from the local people, from the indigenous knowledge and knowledge of people of color is played down. And this affects all areas of life. And let's just take a look at a couple of quotes, right? Colonization is more than physical, it's cultural, psychological, right? Determines whose knowledge is privileged. It means, right, that the Western European derived ways of being and knowing, right, not just knowing and not just being and not just imposing, but that they're explicitly presented as the norm. So what does this mean then in terms of the key underpinning concepts? It means that the colonizers, right, those associated with the Western culture today, right, still are viewed as colonizers, as neo-colonizers, are those who are associated with Western culture, knowledge, and power. So that label is really important. the claim, right, and this is not necessarily something that you will find stated explicitly, but it's definitely one of the underpinning concepts, right? That Western culture and ways of being and acting are unhealthy, not just for those on whom they are imposed, but for the Westerners themselves. Right, and we'll take a little bit more look at this, but I'll just bring it up, and I have it in one of the later slides. Last night at the conference, I'm at the Christian Community Development Association conference. I don't know how many of you are familiar with CCDA, but the Christian Community Development Association was created by John Perkins, has a 30 to 40 year history. And in the plenary session last night, one of the preachers, a woman of color from a Hispanic woman, said we must decolonize well-being. Well, what did she mean by that? What she meant by it, and she went on to explain very briefly, is that those that are part of the Western culture really are focused in on results, and they're engaged in a rat race, right? Those, the indigenous, the people of color, have a much more processual approach to things, don't worry about results as much. So you can see again how this permeates, right? That the Western culture and ways of being are unhealthy, not just in terms of their imposition on others, but for the people themselves who are engaged in them. So what that means, and this is very explicit, right, is that indigenous people and people of color have cultural knowledge, right, that is valuable and necessary, not just for their well-being, but for the well-being of all, right? So really what you're positing is that the knowledge, the culture, right, that has been suppressed or has not been given voice of the indigenous and people of color really holds the keys, right, to well-being, not just for themselves, but for everybody. And as a result, decolonization is necessary for all. And the other key underpinning concept, as I already talked about, is that race is a central element of this, right? So it is very much posited as Western, right? It's Western equals white, and really is equal Eurocentric. Becomes a little bit difficult, as we see, because there are different cultures in Europe. But when you look talking about Spain, about Italy, about Portugal, all colonial powers, those are very different cultures than the Anglo-Saxon cultures. But we'll get into that, right, when we talk about a little bit of the difficulties. So then, let me stop there just for a second. I know I've gone through this fairly quickly. I just now want to go into an overview of decolonization and then leave us a little bit of time. But any questions about the colonization, the full scope of colonization, anything come to mind, or any questions that you have before I go now to decolonization?
So
One question, when you talk about the colonized having better well-being than than those who did the colonization, it's almost like reverse colonization you're talking about.
Right. So in other words, the claim is the colonizers brought over very unhealthy attitudes, cultures, systems, right? And that those who were colonized have much better aspects of that in their college and in their own culture. So yes, I mean, the decolonization movement really is about overthrowing that colonial paradigm and instituting another. And that's what we'll look at the end, you know, as we go through these weeks. Is the question is, it seems to me, especially from a Christian perspective, what you want to do is hold on to the best of both knowledges. You can't just discard all Western knowledge, and you'll see people pushing back. You know, I mean, Western medicine has brought about tremendous things. It has downplayed traditional medicine, so you need a dialogue of both, right? So, yeah, good comment. Any other questions or comments?
I have a quick comment. So, quick comment on. Go ahead.
Go ahead, James.
Go ahead,
Yeah.
Ted.
Go ahead, Ted.
We tend to, or even in our discussions this morning, we've forgotten that there are other powerful entities that have extended their influence throughout the world, or their world, and that the Arab extension of Islam through in an eastward direction, and then in the current day, the overthrow of the Bolsonaro regime in Brazil, and one of the elements of that is the treatment of indigenous peoples.
Right.
There's a colonization aspect to both of those.
There definitely is. One of the claims would be that, yes, there was that expansion by those of the Muslim faith. What people would claim is that, you know, the Western expansion basically overrode that to a large degree, although I think many would say that that's not necessarily true in Africa and some other places. But the Western form of colonization, which has been the latest form, has been the predominant and is the one that still exists. But yeah, you're absolutely right. There are elements to all those who seek to impose their belief in the truth, right? That would lend themselves to this analysis of colonization. Yeah. James, you had something.
Well, I was going to say, we think about the British, and the British sometimes say, who are the British? And apparently they're, you know, partially Viking, partially Saxon, partially German, partially French, a little Welsh, Scottish, and Irish. That's the British. We have no idea who the British are. We're a beautiful mess.
Well, and I believe there are some internal quote unquote colonial tendencies there, right, with the Scottish and with the others, right?
I would say so.
I'd say one other colonization that I don't think is recognized enough is communism is a colonization.
Well, you're absolutely right. And what you will see is, right, people will claim, and I think accurately so, that Marx was fully in a Western mode, right? Marx fully supported, right, Western expansion and industrial and you know, and especially the expansion of worker rule. So Marx was not necessarily somebody, I mean, Marxist analysis and Marxist thoughts have very much been used, right, to critique colonialism, but Marx and the Communist Project is most definitely, I think by all, you know, by just about anybody looking at it, it would be viewed as a colonial project, right? The imposition of a certain way of thinking and doing and organizing things. So very good comment there. All right.
David, you've used the word power 2 or 3 times, and I'm sure you will come back to us some, but just my first thoughts hearing it is, how much does colonialism involve? I have the power, I can do what I want, I can control other people. Whether that's what initiates it, it certainly seems to get woven into it. And then when you're talking about decolonization, how do you get people to give up power or share power?
Yeah, no, that's a great point, and we will look at it next week in more detail, but let's just tackle that real quickly. Really, the colonial project cannot be successful if it's not backed by some kind of coercive force and might, right? In other words, the military project is essential for the colonial project to be successful. So in this day and age, right, it's not just military, and military is probably the least successful of the tools, or the least useful of the tools you have. What you really have is economic and financial, right? And this is part of the analysis, right? The economic and financial, who controls the funds really gets to determine what voices are heard, right? What things are publicized. That's a huge one. And then political power, right? The way that you have people who are governing, right? How do they get into positions to be able to make policy, to break policy, and things along those times. So power, really, the elements of power are absolutely essential. It used to be, right, the coercive military force, no longer, right? Right now, I mean, not no longer. I mean, that still exists there. The threat of coercive military force still exists, but much more now, the institutionalization of that power has occurred, right, in the realms of finance, in the realms of politics. Sal, you have your hand up.
Yeah, just a quick question. I'm new to all of this, and how do we distinguish the spread of Christianity on the African continent and in Asia? How does that fit into this framework?
So people will use the word, right, the colonizing project of mission. So if you look at the history of Christianity, it has generally gone hand in hand with the expansion of political power and military power by the West. And that is analysis that you'll find in just about any textbook. And it's not just kind of the missions movement, right, but it's the quote unquote development movement, right? And so what you will have, and we'll look at this more next week, right? There was a whole call, and they didn't use these terms to decolonize the mission movement, right? And that had quite a bit of success, because the argument there, they could appeal to the fact that the indigenous people should be able to read the Bible on their own, right? And interpret it on their own based on their own situation, and to share their spiritual insights with their brothers and sisters from the West. There was a huge struggle between the missionaries and the denominations that went out in terms of giving up their control over the indigenous leaders in spirituality. So there's a whole history there. So really kind of, and I'm trying to think the term that they used, it wasn't decolonizing, it was another one. So that battle was fought, and I would say has been pretty much is pretty much over, with an acknowledgement right now, especially look at Brazil. Somebody brought up Brazil. I think they per capita are the largest missionary sending country in the world now. I think they've displaced the United States, right? So missionaries, South missionaries are huge. So Christianity was, I mean, of course, the Catholic project, right, was very much glove in hand with the, and explicitly so with the political power of the day. Right, so Protestantism, to a certain degree, was a little bit more decentralized, but there's definitely a lot of relationship. At the same time, just as in Catholicism, you had missionaries that were standing up to the colonial processes and advocating for the rights of indigenous people. That happened both on the Catholic and Protestant side.
Does this colonization concept, does this apply to the gang culture in urban environments?
So yes, you will see it applied to anything and everything that has to do with social analysis and social transformation and change. And the argument there would and I haven't looked into that specifically, I'll look into it for either next week or the week afterwards, is that what you see going on with gang processes, structures, and violence is really a reaction to the colonial project and the oppression that has been internalized into the most vulnerable, right? Trying to become like the colonizers, because the colonizers are people who are respected. They're people who have power. They're people who can exert their will. They're people who can bully others, right? So that internalization of oppression then becomes expressed in reproducing, right, the worst aspects of colonization by those who eventually achieve some level of power. Again, on the gang side, it would be because they do have coercive power, right? It's fascinating. I mean, and holds, I think, a lot of insights, but also insights that we have to be careful about swallowing whole. So.
David, another question, if I could.
Sure.
Back when Thomas Jefferson sent out the Lewis and Clark expedition, those folk learned about the indigenous warfare between the Mandans and all the Indian tribes. And an argument could be made that those internecine warfares between the indigenous Indian tribes is no worse or no better than the colonization that we have presided over. Well, how do we go back and disassociate or associate ourselves with that?
Well, I think that's where the Christian perspective, and this is great where we're getting to it, I'm keeping my eye on the time. This is where I think a Christian perspective is particularly useful, because I think it allows us to tread in certain places that are very difficult sometimes to bring up in certain spaces, because I'll just, for lack of a better term, it's not politically correct, right? So what you just mentioned, right, to me fits fully within it. We are all sinful, both colonizers and colonized. I mean, there's just no way around it. I mean, you brought up one example. What about in Africa, the tribes that fully participated in the slave trade, right? That actually captured people in Africa, right? Africans capturing Africans to deliver them to the Europeans. So, you know, we are all sinful. I think that the question is, if we're looking at this analysis, right, what in it, right, is helpful to us? I don't think there's any doubt, right, that we all do succumb to the tendency to downplay, right, the the incredibly powerful influence, right, that is brought about by the colonial mindset, if I can use those terms, right? We do tend to, as a rule, downplay things that are not scientific. We do tend to downplay certain forms of knowledge just because our culture has told us, right, that this scientific knowledge is the best. Well, I can tell you from working in Latin America, right, traditional medicine based on plants and based on local knowledge was much more powerful in terms of healing some diseases than Western medicine was, right? So I think the way that we deal with that is, first of all, in a very sensitive manner, right? When is it appropriate to bring up kind of these kinds of things? But really to go to the foundation, which is the foundation of the Christian foundation, which is that we're all sinful, right? How is God acting, and how has God been acting both in terms of the colonized and the colonizers? And what can we then use from both of those to create a better world, right? And to create a better approach. And hopefully in the process, give witness and testimony to this kind of approach makes sense and gives us the opportunity to witness to Christ, right? Let me just finish up real quickly here then, right? Again, these are just some quotes that show kind of both the land aspect, the cultural, psychological, and economic aspects, right? And then decolonization, right, is really an ideological project. It's also a very concrete project having to do with structures of power. You can see, and decolonization, it gets, you have to chuckle, right? I mean, at the language, but the process of decolonization itself has been criticized by those who are saying this, again, has been seized by certain people for their own purposes, right? And you don't see necessarily a lot of people of color and indigenous people actually in positions of power and running decolonization projects, which is absolutely fascinating. Just a taste of things that's to come as far as its application. I already mentioned the decolonized well-being from last night. We talked, and a few of you brought up the health aspect, right? So a key aspect that we're going to be looking at, well, what has happened in terms of global healthcare? Why are there such disparities, right, between both health indicators as well as even funding and resourcing for, say, even urban inner city people of color, right? As far as healthcare and health results. You can also see decolonization applied to health policies. You can see it applied in a bunch of different places. Again, I'm just kind of running through these to give you a little bit of a taste, since we're going to go into this extensively next week. And you can see here a little bit of what we were talking about, right? In terms of decolonizing medicine, calls for not throwing out the Western medicine, but incorporating, right, both Western medicine and traditional medicines together for the best results. Just to end up, right, what might an initial theological approach to decolonization look like? So I'm just starting to think about this, and I'd love to, you know, continue these next couple of weeks to kind of, as we go, dig deeper into decolonization from a theological perspective, to think about this. You know, might it be fruitful to think about the fact that, or to use a language or framework that sin attempts to colonize us, right? That Satan, if we can use that word, really attempts to make us, right, into his subjects. And right, in so doing, right, it leads us then in a sinful way to want to colonize others, to impose our thoughts and our ideas on others. And we know, right, that there is a mixing motives. We may want what's best for others. We think and are convinced we know what's best for others, but we haven't looked at that log in our own eye before we try to transform others and their behavior, right? And in the process, right, we lose that ability to learn from others. Again, we move away from sin and go to the way that the Spirit moves. We do know the Spirit moves through everybody, and that we can learn from everybody, right? We see through that mirror dimly. And so, and at the end, then bringing it back to bear on the decolonization framework, might that colonizing and decolonizing, that strict duality hide too much? I think it does. I think it may be useful in some ways. I think in other ways it may actually lead us down the path of reinforcing some of the polarization that occurs and both sides missing what might be good on the other. So let me stop there. I know we're a little bit past 8. See if there are any other comments, questions, suggestions, or things that you would like to explore more, since we have a couple more weeks together.
I would say that decolonization is already here. I mean, the power is shifted in many ways. I mean, the employee-employer relationship, a Black employee has more power than the boss in many cases, because because of the structure that we have for employment, you can't just willy-nilly do anything. You have to, the employee has more power often than the employer. That's my point.
Yeah, and that's a good, it does take us back right into affirmative action and a bunch of other things. I think one of the things in terms of statistics, I believe this is the case, it may not be the case still, but the first people to let go, right, tend to be those people of color, right, and those who have a less seniority. So there still seem to be some structural aspects there that I think are worth investigating. Again, not to swallow whole, because I do think, as you said, decolonization is very much among us in terms of the language, and I think in terms of some of the quote unquote progress, if I can use that word. And as we saw, right, with critical race theory, intersectionality, and others, there may be, right, even a backlash in terms of a pendulum in some areas swinging too far, but it does seem at the same time that there are still some real structural inequities there that need to be dealt with. So good, I appreciate you bringing that up.
David, is there any chance you could share your visuals with us?
Absolutely,
online?
yep. I'll send those to Tim and to Sal so that they can forward them on to you. Mm-hmm.
Just one other one. The Old Testament is a history of colonization.
Absolutely.
Well,
for a long time.
If I may say, yeah, it was colonization and quite violent at that, right?
Yeah.
That brings up a whole other set of issues. Okay, if you're going to make me deal with that, I'll give it some thought for next week. Theologically. Good. Any other thoughts or comments?
James's comment about British colonization. Many of us who have lived in originally colonized areas of the world and worked there and interacted with people know how relatively benign the British colonization was compared with the Dutch, German, French, and Portuguese, particularly the Portuguese. So I lived in Indonesia, and the observation was made that during the Dutch regime, even the postmen were Dutch. They brought people over to deliver the mail, part of their hegemony over the conquered people there.
Mm-hmm. Ted, I appreciate you bringing that up, because there are definitely differences, right, in Western culture along certain ways. I don't want us to lose at the same time the fact that when you talk about kind of differences there, probably what immediately comes to mind is the differences in terms of violence in some portions. The psychological aspect, I don't want us to lose track of. When I was in Honduras, I may have shared this before in past years, I was struck by the level at which, quote unquote, the colonial mentality had been internalized by the Hondurans in this way. It was clear to me that my life as an American they felt was worth so much more than their lives. And this was not just a matter of hospitality, right? But I could walk around untouched because of who I was and who I represented, whereas a Honduran could not. As a matter of fact, I may have shared this, we specifically used Americans in positions, especially during the dirty war that was occurring in Honduras, where Hondurans were being knocked off left and right, because we knew they couldn't touch Americans, right? So both the psychological power and the continuing might of the United States to back us up was there, right? And so those aspects, right, really need to continue to be considered. I don't think it's to the same degree now, because Americans have become a target in many places, but just to bring that aspect up. Yeah.
I think the concept of colonization is something that those who originated the effort with city lights knowingly or unknowingly had in the back of their minds that they had to be very careful going into Southwest Philadelphia, that they did not appear to be, I remember the quote at the time was, we didn't want to be the white knight coming into the neighborhood imposing our values on them, but we had to go in and attempt to assess what was it that they felt they needed, not just what we thought they needed.
That's so good. And that really is the call, right? The call is to take your cues from the local people, right? And many times, right, the local people will invite you in to give your opinions, but because there is internalization of oppression, I've seen this happen time and time again, you can go into a situation and say, well, you're the expert, tell us what to do, right? And will not share what they know and will not share their outstanding ideas, right? And if you don't have that sharing, projects are doomed to fail. So that's where the sensitivity to the power differentials that even lead people to silence themselves continues to be important. I think from a Christian perspective, right, this is key, because we know that, again, as I said before, the Lord speaks through us all. How do we get people to tap into the power of the Spirit that's working in them, right, to be able to overcome, right, some of those fears and to be able to share what they're really thinking? James, yeah.
Quick question. As we were talking about property and things earlier on, it occurred to me that the oceans are important as well. We talked about land, but rule Britannia, Britannia rules the waves, we shall never be slaves, was what we used to sing in church. And the oceans are important in terms of controlling, and have been important. And there's a kind of a spiritual link there between water and spirit.
That is so good, James. It makes me think that space is the other thing, right? I mean, there are nations and cultures that don't have the resources to quote unquote colonize space. And we use that word, right, to colonize space. So once again, right, the more developed nations, right, are the ones that have the edge on this. By the time the quote unquote, the less powerful nations reach space, well, it's already going to be set, right? That's sorry, I interrupted somebody there who was jumping in.
If you have a chance, 1683, Pastorius lands, Francis Daniel Pastorius, the High German dude, lands in Philadelphia. And he wrote two letters, one in 1683 and one in 1700, 17 years later. His letter from 1683 definitely defines what he saw as it relates to the indigenous people and also the settlers that were there before him, that were up the river there. And the bottom line is that gang, Pastorius, Hendricks, and two Optengrafs, two linen weavers from Krefeld, wrote a letter in 1688 when 10 slave ships arrived in Philadelphia, 10 of them. And these guys are living in caves. They gathered at I can't remember the guy's house there on Germantown Avenue. They gathered to write a manifesto against slavery. And as Pastorius is living in a friggin' cave as William Penn. So in terms of this area, with the Swedes and us, when I put us as the afflicted gang that left Europe, we did a magnificent job with the indigenous people. Magnificent.
And
Sorry, guys.
And I think that's why sometimes that colonizing, decolonizing dichotomy doesn't work, especially if you go to kind of white versus non-white, because it does hide, right, a lot of the intricacies and a lot of the things that went on, including movements of resistance by whites against, quote unquote, the colonial project. Not that was, by any stretch of the imagination, a dominant force within colonialism, but it was definitely there. So I appreciate you bringing that up, Sandy. Absolutely. And I think another point to note is that in many ways, indigenous peoples feel that this decolonization movement has been hijacked away from kind of focusing attention on them. So there are significant tensions and conflicts that this creates, right, between the indigenous and between other people of color. So that's important to keep in mind as well. I know we're playing time.
Would you close us in prayer, please?
Sure, I will. Thank you. Lord, we give you thanks for the way that you constantly and consistently speak to us through the power of your Holy Spirit. And we thank you for that. We thank you for the fact that through your Son, Jesus Christ, and his sacrifice for us, Lord, and your gift to us of him, that we have that wonderful counselor with us at all times. Lord, we need that kind of counsel in these kinds of situations. We need to be able to be discerning. Please help us to be prayerfully so as we continue to tackle this issue. Help us to see the things that you want us to see. Help us, Lord, to also become equipped as we enter into these conversations, to do so in a way that really pays tribute, Lord, to you, and Lord, that gives witness to you. We don't know always what that will look like, knowing that many times when we enter into these conversations, there are landmines all over the place. But Lord, help us to use this these next couple of weeks to receive what you will entrust to us in terms of this subject, and help us, Lord, to be forces and agents of change that people feel that they can trust, Lord, that we may build up a reputation for people to whom they can go and to whom they accept in these conversations, even as sometimes they're saying some things that might be a little bit difficult to hear. And I pray that as we do so, Lord, that those who don't know you through your work through us will at the very least become inquisitive and curious as to what drives us and motivates us, and that your Spirit will use that to bring them to you. And those who do know you, who perhaps, Lord, might not be fully aware of all the dimensions of this, that from a spiritual perspective, we and they might grow more mature, and again, be able to give testimony as your faithful disciples. In your name I pray, amen.
Amen.
Amen to that.